Right now, the eastern United States is baking in temperatures that belong in late July. We are talking about Washington, D.C., pushing toward 90 degrees Fahrenheit. Philadelphia doing the same. New York City pressing against all-time generational records. The interior of Boston, a city that was brushing snow off its sidewalks just weeks ago, is now sitting in stagnant, sweltering air. This is not a gentle, warm spring afternoon. This is oppressive, mid-summer heat arriving months ahead of schedule, and the national headlines are treating it like a quirky, isolated weather event. They are telling you records will fall. They are calling it a once-in-a-decade anomaly. But the headlines are completely missing the terrifying reality of what is actually happening. Because the atmosphere is not doing this on its own, the cities baking on the eastern seaboard are just the tip of the spear. This heat wave is not the event. It is merely the announcement of the event. Something enormous, something already in motion, is pushing the global atmosphere far beyond what every major forecast model predicted. When meteorologists pull up their data and look at the atmospheric pressure at the 500 millibar level, roughly 18,000 feet above our heads, they are looking at a dome of warm, sinking air that is genuinely difficult to overstate. Right now, that height anomaly over the eastern United States is sitting at the 99th percentile for this time of year. Out of every April day in the entire historical record, this atmospheric structure ranks in the top 1%. But here is where things get genuinely unsettling. The incredibly sophisticated computational models that run modern meteorology knew a ridge was coming. They saw the data. They flagged the incoming heat as exceptional. Forecasters looked at those raw numbers, adjusted their predictions upward, and still got it completely wrong. The actual temperatures came in hotter than even the most aggressively adjusted models anticipated. Reality just outran our best supercomputers. When a weather event outperforms every layer of human prediction and computational modeling, it is a glaring red flag. It is a signal that something is fundamentally missing from the equation. The atmosphere is responding to a massive injection of thermal energy. But that energy is not coming from the sun heating the dry April ground. You are witnessing a forcing mismatch. Think of it like setting your oven to 350 degrees, but the thermometer inside reads 420. You haven't changed the dial. The oven itself is outputting more heat than the setting should allow. In atmospheric terms, that extra output has to come from somewhere. Energy does not just materialize from the void. So where is the ghost energy coming from? It is coming from a region that the official climate indices are currently ignoring. If you look at the official classification of the El Niño Southern Oscillation right now, the Oceanic Niño Index says we are in a neutral state. The official data tells you there is nothing to worry about. The system is quiet. Stand down. But the atmosphere hasn't read that official memo. The atmosphere is behaving as if a massive, highly destructive super El Niño has already arrived. And it is behaving that way because of what is lurking hundreds of meters beneath the surface of the Pacific Ocean. Deep below the equatorial Pacific, a colossal reservoir of anomalously warm water running 5 degrees Celsius above average is currently migrating eastward. This is not a surface wave you can see from a beach. This is a massive subsurface thermal pulse, a downwelling Kelvin wave carrying a staggering amount of latent heat. It is a continuous, basin-scale structure of elevated ocean temperatures that is already altering the distribution of atmospheric convection even before it fully breaches the surface. And as this hidden leviathan moves, it is tearing apart the standard atmospheric rulebook. It is disrupting the Walker circulation. It is forcing the jet stream into massive, buckling Rossby waves. It is creating extreme southward plunges of Arctic air in the west and extreme northward surges of tropical heat in the east. It is the reason why, at the exact same moment the East Coast is sweating through July heat, other parts of the continent are dealing with anomalous snow and severe, violent thunderstorm outbreaks. But the most alarming signal of all is happening right off the coast of California. A marine heat wave has rapidly materialized, pushing sea surface temperatures to levels classified as Category 5, the absolute maximum on the scale. This is extreme, unprecedented warmth for April, driven by the collapse of the cold, upwelling currents that normally protect that coastline. The Pacific is actively shutting down its cooling mechanisms. We are not looking at a localized weather quirk. We are looking at the rapid, violent preconditioning of the global climate system. The system is loading, the energy is pooling. The current atmospheric chaos is just a rehearsal. If this is what happens when the Pacific is merely clearing its throat, what exactly is going to happen when this massive 5-degree thermal anomaly finally erupts to the surface this summer? To understand the sheer scale of the catastrophe that is quietly building in the dark waters of the Pacific, you have to see what the models missed. And the truth is going to change how you look at every weather forecast from this day forward. To truly grasp why this exact moment is so dangerous, you have to understand the illusion of safety we are currently living inside. Right now, millions of people are checking their phones, seeing a 90-degree forecast in spring, and treating it as a bizarre meteorological fluke. They assume that next week, the pattern will break. They assume the jet stream will flatten out, the temperatures will regress to the mean, and the comforting rhythm of standard seasonal transition will resume. But regression to the mean is no longer on the table. The mean has been obliterated. The atmosphere has crossed a threshold from which it cannot simply retreat, and the fact that official channels are still whispering about neutral conditions is not a comfort. It is a warning siren. April is the atmospheric pivot point for the Northern Hemisphere. It is the critical window where the deep cold of winter relinquishes its grip and the atmosphere slowly, deliberately reorganizes itself for the warm season. This transition relies on a delicate balance of temperature gradients between the equator and the poles. But that 5-degree subsurface thermal bomb migrating across the Pacific has violently hijacked this seasonal pivot. By injecting massive amounts of latent heat into the system prematurely, it has shattered the atmospheric inertia that normally protects us from midsummer extremes in spring. When you break heat records in April by this magnitude, the consequences do not reset at midnight. They compound. The soil across the eastern seaboard and deep into the interior continent is baking weeks ahead of schedule. The moisture locked in that soil moisture that is absolutely vital for regulating ground temperatures during the peak heat of July and August is evaporating now. The ground is being flash-dried. By the time the actual summer solstice arrives, the natural evaporative cooling mechanisms that normally prevent heat waves from becoming deadly will be gone. The land will be a thermal battery, ready to absorb and radiate heat back into the lower atmosphere with devastating efficiency. This is why the timing of this preconditioning phase is so catastrophic. We are not just facing a hotter summer, we are facing a structural failure of our expected climate baseline. The buckling of the jet stream into these massive, amplified Rossby waves creates atmospheric roadblocks. These are blocking patterns that lock weather systems in place for weeks at a time. The heat domes will not simply roll through over a weekend. They will anchor themselves over densely populated corridors and the agricultural heartlands of the continent. Think about what a stationary, locked-in heat dome does to a modern power grid. Our electrical infrastructure was engineered for the thermal limits of the 20th century. It was designed with the assumption that extreme heat would be transient, allowing transformers to cool overnight and power plants to cycle down. But the physics of the atmosphere currently taking shape guarantee a sustained, relentless demand for cooling, paired with nighttime temperatures that refuse to drop. When the grid cannot cool, it fails. And a grid failure, under a stagnant 99th percentile heat dome, quickly escalates from an economic inconvenience to a mass casualty event. Simultaneously, the exact same amplified jet stream that locks deadly heat over one region will anchor catastrophic, relentless precipitation over another. The moisture being evaporated off these record-warm oceans has to come down. When an atmospheric river gets funneled into a stalled low-pressure trough, the resulting precipitation doesn't just cause localized flooding. It wipes out entire planting seasons. It overtops reservoirs. It paralyzes supply chains that rely on predictable, navigable routes. The extremes on both ends of the spectrum, relentless drought and stationary deluge, are being magnified by the exact same Pacific energy source. And yet, the official warning systems are paralyzed by their own rigid definitions. The bureaucratic machinery of institutional meteorology is bound by historical parameters. They require 3-month rolling averages to officially declare a super El Niño. They are waiting for the oceanic and atmospheric variables to align perfectly with the textbooks written decades ago. But the physics of this ocean are operating faster than the bureaucratic lag of the agencies tasked with monitoring them. By relying on smoothed-out indices and delayed classifications, we are blinding ourselves to the raw, violent reality unfolding in real time. We are essentially watching the ocean draw back a massive bowstring, feeling the tension physically warp the air above our cities, and ignoring it because the official rulebook says the arrow hasn't been released yet. The stakes right now are nothing short of existential for vulnerable populations, global agriculture, and critical infrastructure. Every day that passes under this false sense of neutral security is a day lost for meaningful preparation. Water managers are making decisions based on snowpack and evaporation models that are already obsolete. Agricultural markets are pricing in yields that this atmosphere will not allow to grow. Emergency management agencies are budgeting for a typical summer severe weather season, completely unaware that the board has been flipped. We are standing in the narrow, rapidly closing window between the initial shockwave and the full kinetic impact of the event. The energy is already in the system. The atmosphere is already warping to accommodate it. The only thing left to discover is exactly how this unprecedented thermal load will tear through our immediate future. To the average person walking down the street right now, the sky does not look like a loaded weapon. It just looks like a surprisingly pleasant, if slightly unseasonable, spring day. That is the most insidious nature of atmospheric physics. It does not announce its most violent structural shifts with cinematic thunderclaps or immediate, apocalyptic devastation. It announces them with a gentle, anomalous, warm breeze, a stubborn stretch of cloudless blue skies, and a weekend that brings people out to the parks and beaches a month earlier than they expected. We step outside, feel the 85-degree air against our skin in a month that should demand a light jacket, and we simply adjust our wardrobe. We do not look up and see a system in the throes of a terminal structural failure. We see a fluke. We have developed a deep, almost impenetrable cultural immunity to extreme weather warnings. For over a decade, the public has been relentlessly bombarded with headlines, declaring every subsequent summer the hottest on record. We have lived through heat domes. We have watched wildfire smoke tint our skies orange. And we have seen floodwaters breach historic high water marks. Because of this constant exposure, the concept of unprecedented has lost its teeth. It has devolved into atmospheric white noise. When we hear that a historic heat wave is building across the continent, our brains automatically deploy a psychological defense mechanism, mapping this terrifying, abstract concept onto our own familiar, survivable experiences. We think back to a particularly brutal week in July a few years ago. We remember the sticky discomfort, the relentless humming of the neighborhood air conditioning units, perhaps a localized brownout that lasted an afternoon, and the profound relief when the cold front finally pushed through on a Sunday evening, breaking the humidity. We survived it. We adapted. The modern human psyche is fundamentally wired to expect a return to baseline. We assume that no matter how severe the spike in temperature, the rubber band will eventually snap back. We assume that whatever is coming this summer will simply be a slightly more intense, slightly more inconvenient version of what we have already endured. This psychological anchoring is deeply reinforced by the very institutions and systems designed to inform and protect us. If you tune into your local evening broadcast, the weather segment follows a comforting, highly predictable script. The meteorologist stands in front of a familiar, color-coded map, points to a sprawling ridge of high pressure dominating the eastern half of the country, and advises you to stay hydrated, check on your elderly neighbors, and keep your pets indoors during the peak afternoon heating. They use historical analogues to contextualize the anomaly, pulling up graphics that compare this April to the sudden spring warm-up of 2012 or the early season heat of 1998. The implicit, reassuring message broadcast to millions of living rooms is always the same. We have seen this before. We have a historical baseline for this behavior, and the atmosphere, while temporarily agitated, will eventually autocorrect and return to its expected seasonal rhythm. Even when the conversation shifts to the broader, planetary-scale drivers, when the mainstream media finally turns its attention to the Pacific Ocean and begins reporting on the whispers of a developing El Niño, the narrative remains profoundly conventional and safe. El Niño is a household term. We learn about it in middle school earth science classes. We think of it as a known quantity, a familiar, cyclical antagonist in the ongoing drama of global weather patterns. When the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration issues an official El Niño watch, public and institutional perception immediately defaults to a well-worn playbook. We know this playbook by heart. We expect a wetter, stormier winter for the southern tier of the United States and California. We expect milder, drier conditions across the northern states and into Canada. We expect a potential dampening of hurricane activity in the Atlantic basin due to increased wind shear. We point to the legendary, generation-defining Godzilla El Niños of 1997 and 2015 as our absolute, unimpeachable worst-case scenarios. We look at the historical data logged during those years. We measure our current infrastructure, our sea walls, and our power grids against those specific, finite stress tests, and we calculate that we can confidently weather the storm. The narrative insists that the ocean is a slow, lumbering giant, operating on a timeline of months and seasons, telegraphing its punches so far in advance that we have ample time to prepare. Entire sectors of the global economy are currently operating on this exact illusion of historical predictability. Commodities traders in Chicago and London are looking at these standard, smoothed-out ENSO forecasts and adjusting their crop yield models for corn, wheat, and soybeans, based entirely on how the American Midwest and the South American plains responded during previous El Niño transitions. They are pricing in a manageable level of risk. Water resource managers in the drought-prone Colorado River Basin are running complex hydrological simulations based on the snowpack melt rates of the early 2000s, assuming the runoff will follow a standard, recognizable curve. City planners and emergency management directors in urban heat islands like Phoenix, Dallas, and Las Vegas are reviewing their municipal heat mitigation strategies, fully confident that their emergency cooling centers and grid load shedding protocols, which successfully held the line during the sweltering peaks of 2023, will be more than sufficient to handle the summer of 2026. Every single tier of our society, from the individual homeowner adjusting their smart thermostat to the federal disaster coordinator allocating emergency relief budgets, is operating under the fundamental, unquestioned assumption that the climate system still obeys the laws of cyclical history. We look at the sprawling, colorful maps of Pacific sea surface temperatures published online. We see the familiar, iconic band of warming water stretching westward from the coast of Peru, glowing in hues of yellow and orange against the blue background of the Pacific. We nod our heads because it looks exactly like the diagrams in the textbooks. It looks like a classic, standard, developing El Niño. It presents itself as a phenomenon we can quantify, model, package into an algorithm, and neatly prepare for using the established, trusted tools of modern meteorology. We trust the surface. We trust what we can easily see, measure, and compare to our past. We believe the story the ocean is telling us right now because it is a story we already know how to survive. But if you bypass the smoothed-out, public-facing graphics, look past the 30-day rolling averages, and pull the raw, unfiltered, Second-by-second telemetry coming from the deep ocean, Argo floats, and the Jason, three-satellite array. The comforting illusion of a standard climate cycle immediately begins to fracture. Deep within the data sets that the evening news never shows you, something is deeply, structurally misaligned. You begin to notice pressure gradients refusing to balance, trade winds behaving in ways that defy the fundamental equations of atmospheric dynamics, and a massive subsurface thermal profile that no historical analog from 1997 or 2015 can possibly explain. The numbers are quietly, violently suggesting that the familiar, brightly colored map we are all staring at is a lie, masking a completely different, entirely unrecognizable entity gathering strength in the dark. The unspoken truth within the highest echelons of the meteorological community right now, the reality being frantically debated in encrypted research channels at NOAA, the ECMWF, and the Japan Meteorological Agency, yet entirely sanitized before it reaches your local news anchor, is that our predictive models are not merely lagging behind the data. They are actively hallucinating. We have placed our blind faith in the most sophisticated supercomputers on the planet, assuming that their processing power is a shield against the unknown. But algorithms are fundamentally historical creatures. They are trained on the past. They look at the incoming telemetry from the Pacific Basin. They see thermal outputs and pressure gradients that violate the established boundaries of atmospheric physics, and they do what they were programmed to do. They correct the error. When an Argo float 300 meters below the surface off the coast of Papua New Guinea transmits a water temperature spike that statistically should not exist, the model assumes a sensor malfunction. It applies a smoothing function. It rounds down the apocalypse to fit a recognizable spreadsheet. The models are forcing impossible real-time data to conform to a survivable history. The past is actively blinding us to the present. That is the hidden angle no one is framing correctly. We are not failing to see the monster because we lack the data. We are failing to see it because our instruments are trying to protect our fragile understanding of how the Earth is supposed to work. But the Earth has stopped caring about our historical baselines. The loop has broken. Look at what is actually happening, not over the course of seasons, but in the last 72 hours. The pace of this event is accelerating at a velocity that defies the fundamental laws of fluid dynamics. For decades, the transition into a major El Niño was a lumbering, predictable affair. Trade winds would weaken over a period of months. Subsurface heat would slowly detach from the western Pacific pool and take 60 to 90 days to drift eastward across the equator in the form of a downwelling Kelvin wave. You could track it like a freight train on a schedule. That is not what is happening right now. The trade winds have not merely weakened. Across a span of 4,000 miles of open ocean, they have violently reversed. We are seeing sustained westerly bursts of 30 to 40 knots in regions where they have never been recorded. These are not wind anomalies. They are atmospheric sledgehammers driving the ocean's surface eastward. And beneath that surface, the thermocline, the vital, invisible boundary layer that separates the warm surface water from the freezing abyss, is completely collapsing. It is not migrating, it is dissolving. The heat reservoir is no longer moving at the speed of a wave. It is erupting upward across the entire basin simultaneously. The Jason, 3-satellite altimetry data, when stripped of its historical smoothing filters, shows the surface of the eastern Pacific physically bulging outward, rising by centimeters in a matter of days due to pure thermal expansion. The heat is so intense and rising so fast that the physical volume of the ocean is expanding faster than the gravity of the Earth can pull it back down. This is the phase state change we missed while we were arguing about whether to call this a super El Niño. The pacing of planetary mechanics has shifted from a slow burn to a sprint, and the atmosphere, which acts as the exhaust engine for the ocean, is now choking on the intake. When you inject this volume of thermal energy into the troposphere this rapidly, the sky does not have the capacity to process it gently. The atmosphere attempts to balance the books, pulling that latent heat up from the equator and throwing it toward the poles. But the pipeline is overwhelmed. The jet stream, the high-altitude river of air that dictates the weather for the entire northern hemisphere, is buckling under the pressure. Watch the real-time 500 millibar wind vectors. The jet stream is no longer meandering, it is fracturing. It is snapping into jagged, stationary shards. This is exactly why 85-degree air is sitting stagnant over Boston and New York in April. It is not a random spring heatwave. It is a symptom of a violently fragmented jet stream that has completely lost its structural integrity. The atmospheric river has slammed into a brick wall of anomalous heat and shattered. The ridges of high pressure are no longer transient weather systems. They are atmospheric concrete, locking into place, blocking all normal west to east progression of weather, and the troughs, the deep plunges of cold air, are being forced to dig further south than ever before, creating catastrophic shear zones. Things are breaking fast, and they are breaking everywhere at once. Off the coast of California, the marine layer, the natural air conditioning system for the entire western seaboard, is evaporating. The sea surface temperatures from San Diego to Seattle have spiked by 4 degrees Celsius in less than 3 weeks. That is mathematically impossible under the standard model. Water requires an astronomical amount of energy to heat up. To see a temperature spike of that magnitude in that time frame means the heat flux coming off the ocean floor is bypassing the normal rules of thermal diffusion. The marine heat wave is not building, it has detonated. The coastal fog is vanishing. The vegetation in the Sierra Nevadas is flash drying a full 2 months ahead of fire season. Simultaneously, look at the Gulf of Mexico. Look at the loop current. It is running hot, pulling deep boiling water up from the Caribbean and slamming it into the southern coast of the United States. The humidity levels over Texas and Louisiana are already reading like late August. The atmosphere is loading itself with an unprecedented volume of water vapor, transforming the sky into an ocean of its own. When those stagnant, high-pressure domes finally buckle, when the atmospheric concrete cracks, that moisture is going to come down in precipitation rates that our municipal drainage systems were simply not engineered to survive. We are tracking a synchronized, multi-hemispheric system failure happening in fast forward. The slow-moving giant we were warned about in middle school earth science does not exist anymore. We are watching the atmosphere forcefully redraw the map of the world in real time, abandoning the slow, seasonal transitions we rely on to grow our food, manage our water, and cool our cities. The models told us we had until late summer to prepare for the peak of this event. The models told us the ocean would take its time. The models lied. The event is not approaching. It is not gathering strength for a future strike. The threshold has already been breached. The timeline has collapsed. The heat is already here, and the atmosphere is tearing itself apart trying to contain it. But this is exactly where the panic echoing through those encrypted research channels is entirely misplaced, blinding them to the true nature of the threat. They are staring at the fractured jet stream, the collapsing thermocline, and the boiling surface of the Pacific, treating them as the final act of this disaster. They are looking at the 85-degree air suffocating the eastern seaboard in mid-April and treating it as the climax of an oceanic anomaly. That is the ultimate blind spot. The unspoken truth, the dark, terrifying reality that no one wants to say out loud because it defies every foundational principle of modern climatology, is that the ocean is not the primary aggressor in this scenario. The atmosphere is not a fragile container struggling to hold back the heat. It is the catalyst. It is pulling the trigger. We have been conditioned by a century of meteorological science to believe that the ocean heats up first and the atmosphere passively responds. The water gets warm. It warms the air above it. The air expands. The winds shift. It is a linear, predictable, manageable chain of cause and effect. But what the raw, unfiltered satellite altimetry and deep ocean sensor data are screaming right now is that the arrow of causality has violently reversed. The shattered jet stream is not merely a byproduct of the ocean's heat. It is actively dredging the deep ocean. The atmospheric pressure drops we are seeing across the northern Pacific are so profound, so structurally aberrant, that they have effectively turned the sky into a planetary-scale vacuum. The atmosphere is no longer just absorbing thermal energy, it is mechanically extracting it from the abyssal depths, dragging the heat to the surface at a velocity that bypasses the normal laws of thermal diffusion. That is why the models hallucinated. They have a hard-coded speed limit for how fast energy can transfer between water and air. They assumed the ocean was driving the car. They did not account for the atmosphere hijacking the engine and slamming its foot on the gas. And because everyone is staring at the ocean, waiting for a traditional, lumbering El Niño to arrive by late summer, they are entirely ignoring what the atmosphere is doing to the landmass right beneath our feet right now. The pacing of this event has shifted from a slow, seasonal burn into a rapid-fire kinetic breakdown. Forget about what happens in July or August. Look at the telemetry from the ground this week. While the media focuses on the novelty of early beach days in Massachusetts and New York, a silent, catastrophic mechanism is locking into place across the interior of the North American continent. It is called a flash drought, and it is moving with the speed of a wildfire. Because the jet stream has shattered into stationary, blocking shards, the massive dome of high pressure dominating the continent is acting like an atmospheric magnifying glass. The unseasonable heat is not just warming the air, it is aggressively vaporizing the soil moisture. Normally, the spring sun uses a vast portion of its energy to evaporate water from the damp earth. It is an endothermic process. It provides a natural cooling effect. But when that moisture is violently stripped from the topsoil in a matter of days rather than months, a terrifying thermodynamic switch gets flipped. The solar radiation has no water left to evaporate. The energy has nowhere else to go, so it begins to heat the dirt directly. The process shifts from latent heat to sensible heat. The ground itself becomes a radiator. This is the hidden gear in the machine that is accelerating the timeline beyond the capacity of our predictive models. The soil across the Great Plains, the Midwest, and the Ohio River Valley is flash-baking. By the first week of May, an area of agricultural land, roughly the size of Western Europe, will be functionally transformed into a thermal battery, radiating dry, blistering heat back into the already stagnant air above it. It creates a localized, self-sustaining feedback loop. The hotter the ground gets, the harder it pushes back against any approaching weather systems, further reinforcing the atmospheric concrete of the high-pressure ridge. It is building an impenetrable fortress of dead, dry air. And here is where the acceleration turns deadly. We are psychologically prepared to deal with daytime high temperatures. We have cooling centers, air conditioning, and municipal protocols for when the mercury hits 95 or 100 degrees. But human physiology, and more importantly, our civil infrastructure, is entirely dependent on the nighttime low. We require the sun to go down and the air to cool so that materials can contract, so that power transformers can shed their thermal load, so that concrete and steel can radiate the energy they absorbed during the day. Because of this specific, locked-in atmospheric structure, the nighttime cooling mechanism is being shut off. The stagnant air mass traps the sensible heat radiating from the baked soil. We are looking at a scenario where the temperature in major urban centers, from Chicago to Philadelphia, will not drop below 80 degrees for weeks at a time. The power grids are not engineered for this continuous, unbroken thermal stress. Transformers do not fail because it gets hot at 2 p.m. They fail because they remain hot at 3 a.m. Asphalt begins to rut and buckle, not because the sun is beating down on it, but because the molecular structure never gets the chance to contract and solidify overnight. Steel railway lines expand and warp, forcing the suspension of freight traffic. The infrastructure does not explode, it simply exhausts itself and melts. Yet the meteorologists on your local news will not warn you about this cascading failure. They cannot. To do so would require stepping outside the safety of their historical analogies. It would require admitting that the 1997 and 2015 El Niño playbooks are entirely useless pieces of history. They are trapped in a paradigm of institutional paralysis. They are waiting for the National Weather Service to issue a standard, recognizable alert. But the alert system is predicated on events with a known beginning, middle, and end. How do you issue an alert for the atmosphere fundamentally redrawing the thermodynamic map of the hemisphere in real time? The models keep insisting that this ridge will eventually break down, that a trough will sweep in from the west and return us to a state of atmospheric equilibrium. But the models are blind to the fact that the west is currently a loaded gun pointing straight at the heart of the continent. Look back at the Gulf of Mexico. Look at the loop current running at unprecedented, boiling temperatures, while the interior of the country is baking itself into a dry, high-pressure fortress. The periphery is drowning in latent energy. The evaporation rates off the Gulf and the hyperheated Pacific coast of Mexico are pumping hundreds of millions of tons of water vapor into the lower atmosphere. That moisture is being trapped, squeezed against the edges of the continental high-pressure dome. It is moving northward, sliding up through Texas, hugging the eastern edge of the Rockies, looking for a weakness in the atmospheric concrete. When it finds one, the resulting collision will not be a normal spring thunderstorm. When a hypersaturated, boiling plume of oceanic moisture slams into a boundary layer of bone-dry, superheated continental air, the atmosphere reacts with explosive violence. The gradients are too extreme. We are looking at the imminent genesis of mesoscale convective systems on a scale we do not have a category for. Imagine a derecho, a widespread, long-lived, straight-line windstorm, but fueled by the thermal energy of a midsummer hurricane, tearing across the plains and the Midwest, feeding off the heat, radiating from the flash-baked soil. Because the jet stream is shattered, these systems will not sweep through and clear the air. They will stall. They will train over the exact same agricultural basins and urban centers for days, dumping historic volumes of precipitation onto ground that has been baked so hard it has lost its capacity to absorb water. The runoff will be instantaneous. Flash flooding will occur on terrain that, just a week prior, was in the grip of a flash drought. The whiplash between these two extremes, from bone-dry thermal baking to catastrophic, stalled deluge, is the hallmark of a climate system that has lost its buffering capacity. The shock absorbers have been blown out. The terrifying reality unfolding right now, hidden beneath the pleasant, unseasonable warmth of an April afternoon, is the sheer velocity of this transition. The institutions designed to protect us are desperately trying to force this event into a familiar narrative of a strong summer El Niño. They are focused on ocean temperatures months from now, entirely missing the fact that the atmosphere has already severed its ties to the historical record. The atmosphere is not waiting for the ocean to peak. It is actively forcing the issue, vacuuming deep-sea heat, flash-baking the continents, shutting down the nighttime cooling cycle, and loading the periphery with an explosive volume of water vapor. The public is walking through the parks, enjoying the early spring, entirely unaware that the sky above them has fundamentally rewired its operating system. They are adjusting their wardrobes for a fluke, while the very physics of the world they rely on are accelerating toward a violent, synchronized reckoning. The data is clear, unsmoothed, and terrifying. The countdown did not start today. We are already in the final seconds of the sequence. If you want to understand how the smartest minds on the planet could be staring directly at a loaded, cocked atmospheric weapon and still issue a forecast for a mild, manageable summer, you have to understand the fatal flaw in the architecture of modern meteorology. You have to look at the dashboard they are using to drive the car. Right now, the global meteorological community is anchored to a metric called the Oceanic Niño Index, or the ONI. It is the gold standard, the holy grail of climate forecasting, the bureaucratic trigger that dictates whether billions of dollars in agricultural hedges, emergency management funds, and municipal preparations are deployed. The ONI is calculated by taking the sea surface temperature in a very specific, arbitrary rectangular box in the central equatorial Pacific, known as the Niño 3.4 region, and measuring how far it deviates from the historical average. But here is the catch. and it is a catch that is currently sealing our fate. They do not just look at today's temperature, they look at a 3-month rolling average. And to officially declare an El Niño event, that 3-month average must remain above a ½ degree Celsius for 5 consecutive, overlapping periods. It is a system explicitly designed by cautious scientists to prevent false alarms. It is a system built to filter out the noise, to smooth over the erratic, daily spikes of the ocean, and to ensure that when an official agency issues a warning, they are statistically, unimpeachably correct. But a system designed to wait for 5 months of confirmed, smoothed-out data before declaring a crisis is a system inherently designed to write an autopsy, not a forecast. This is the deadly contrast between conventional climatology and the raw, violent reality of the physics unfolding right now. The institutions are operating on an administrative timeline. They are waiting for the paperwork of the ocean to clear. They are watching a 3-month rolling average slowly creep upward, pointing to the gentle slope of the graph on their monitors and assuring the public that the transition is proceeding normally. They are acting like a doctor, refusing to treat a patient bleeding out on the table because they are waiting for the quarterly blood work to come back from the lab. The breakthrough understanding, the reality that you are looking at right now when you strip away the bureaucratic smoothing filters, is that the atmosphere does not operate on a 3-month rolling average. The atmosphere does not respect the arbitrary borders of the Niño 3.4 box. It does not wait for an official press release from the World Meteorological Organization before it shatters a jet stream. When you look at the raw, daily telemetry from the JSON, 3 altimetry satellites, you do not see a gentle, smoothed-out warming trend. You see violent, highly localized eruptions of thermal energy. You see pockets of the Pacific Ocean spiking by 3, 4, even 5 degrees Celsius in a matter of 72 hours, often occurring just outside the boundary lines of the official measurement zones. Because of the way conventional models process data, these catastrophic, concentrated spikes are mathematically diluted. They are dumped into a statistical blender with thousands of miles of cooler water averaged out over 90 days and flattened. The models take a localized detonation of oceanic heat, smooth it into a gentle numerical ripple, and spit out a forecast that says everything is fine. By prioritizing statistical certainty over real-time thermodynamic reality, the conventional methodology is actively erasing the threat from the map. It is the equivalent of standing in a burning house and declaring the average temperature of the property is only 70 degrees. This institutional conservatism is compounded by an even more dangerous flaw, the reliance on historical analogues. Right now, forecasters are desperately trying to map the telemetry of April 2026 onto the ghosts of 1997 and 2015. They pull up the charts from those legendary Super El Niño years, overlay them onto today's data, and point to the similarities in subsurface heat volumes. They publish papers stating, the subsurface anomaly is tracking exactly like it did in May of 1997. Therefore, we can expect the atmospheric response to mimic the winter of 1998. It is a comforting, logical, and entirely catastrophic way to think. The fatal flaw in using historical analogues is the assumption that the baseline of the planet has remained static. It has not. Comparing the oceanic and atmospheric mechanics of 2026 to 1997 is like trying to calculate the explosive yield of a stick of dynamite, but ignoring the fact that you just threw it into a room completely filled with aerosolized gasoline. The spark might be exactly the same, but the environment it ignites is fundamentally, structurally different. In 1997, the global ocean was carrying significantly less latent heat. The Arctic was colder. The temperature gradients between the equator and the poles, the very gradients that give the jet stream its shape and velocity, were steeper and more robust. When the Pacific expelled its heat into the sky 29 years ago, the atmosphere had the capacity to absorb, transport, and distribute that energy with a relative degree of mechanical stability. The shock absorbers of the climate system were fully intact. Today, those shock absorbers are gone. The global ocean has absorbed over 90% of the excess thermal energy trapped by the atmosphere over the last century. The baseline temperature of the water completely outside the equatorial Pacific is already running at record highs. The Arctic is warming up to 4 times faster than the rest of the planet, aggressively flattening the temperature gradient required to keep the jet stream stable. The entire planetary system is preconditioned for failure. Conventional modeling treats the current Pacific anomaly as an isolated variable introduced into a stable equation. It assumes a linear progression. If the ocean warms by a factor of X, the atmosphere will shift by a factor of Y. But fluid dynamics on a planetary scale, in a hypersaturated environment, are strictly non-linear. We are not dealing with addition, we are dealing with multiplication. We are dealing with exponential amplification. When you inject a sudden, massive surge of oceanic heat into an atmosphere that is already operating at its maximum thermal capacity, the response is not a proportional shift in weather patterns. The response is a structural collapse. The heat does not just politely alter the course of the jet stream, it paralyzes it. It creates the massive, locked-in atmospheric blocking patterns that are currently flash-baking the North American interior. The traditional models cannot see this coming because their source code was written in a world that no longer exists. They are programmed to expect a linear atmospheric response because, historically, the atmosphere always had the room to respond linearly. Now, it is hitting a hard physical ceiling, and the models are simply not equipped to compute the physics of a ceiling crash. You can see this fatal disconnect clearly in how the mainstream scientific community talks about the ocean-atmosphere coupling. For decades, the standard procedure has been to treat the ocean as the slow, lumbering pacemaker. The conventional wisdom states that the ocean is a dense thermal battery, while the atmosphere is a chaotic, fast-moving, but ultimately reactive layer of gas. Because water takes so much longer to heat up and cool down than air, the models assume a built-in temporal lag. They assume that if the Pacific hits a critical temperature threshold in June, the atmosphere will not fully lock into an El Niño pattern until October or November. This built-in lag is the exact reason why commodities traders, municipal planners, and agricultural sectors are not panicking. They look at the forecast and genuinely believe they have a 6-month runway to prepare. But that lag time was a luxury afforded to us by a cooler planet. The breakthrough insight, the reality that isolates the true magnitude of the danger, is that the coupling timeline between the ocean and the atmosphere has fundamentally evaporated. Because the lower troposphere is already running so hot, it is acting like a thermal superconductor. The boundary layer where the ocean meets the air has become incredibly volatile. When the subsurface heat currently pooling in the Pacific fully breaches the surface, it is not going to take months for the atmosphere to react. It is not going to slowly alter the trade winds over the course of an entire season. The transfer of energy is going to be instantaneous. We are watching the death of the atmospheric lag. The moment that oceanic heat crosses the threshold, the hyper-warm air above it will instantly vaporize millions of tons of seawater, rapidly accelerating the reversal of the trade winds, which will in turn drag even more subsurface heat to the surface, creating an immediate, runaway feedback loop. The atmosphere will snap into a terminal configuration in a matter of days, not months. The models are predicting a slow-motion wave, completely blind to the fact that the ocean and the atmosphere are about to execute a high-speed thermal short-circuit. Yet, the officials at the climate prediction centers remain bound by their rigid protocols. They are still feeding smoothed 30-day averages into algorithms calibrated for the 1990s, searching for the methodical progression of a historical event that will never arrive. They are meticulously charting the approach of a horse-drawn carriage while standing directly on the tracks of a high-speed rail line. The institutional penalty for sounding a false alarm has become so culturally ingrained that forecasters would rather be catastrophically late than momentarily wrong. This is the critical divergence between what is published on a government dashboard and what is physically tearing through the sky. The conventional approach demands that we measure the climate by its averages, its historical precedents, and its slow, bureaucratic categorizations. It demands that we look at the 85-degree day in April as an isolated fluke, separate from the boiling ocean, separate from the silent flash drought, separate from the shattering jet stream. It fragments the crisis into digestible, unalarming pieces, ensuring that nobody panics until the ONI officially crosses a plus 0.5-degree threshold for 5 consecutive months. But the physics of the Earth do not require a bureaucratic rubber stamp to execute a catastrophe. The atmosphere is not waiting for a committee to agree on the data. It is pulling the heat, it is locking the ridges, it is stalling the moisture, and it is doing it right now, in real time, operating on rules of hyper-saturated thermodynamics that have completely bypassed the models designed to track them. To rely on the conventional methodology right now is to accept a fatal illusion of control. It is to believe that because we have mapped the past, we have somehow leashed the future. But the models are broken. The historical analogues are dead. The safety net of the atmospheric lag has burned away. What you are witnessing is not the build-up to a familiar summer anomaly. You are witnessing the raw, unsmoothed, non-linear detonation of a climate system that has finally run out of room to adapt. And the very institutions built to warn us are exactly what is keeping us completely, blissfully blind. If you want to tear the blindfold off and actually survive the structural realignment of our atmosphere, you have to stop looking at the dashboard and start looking directly into the engine. You have to bypass the bureaucratic lag entirely. What I am about to show you is the raw, unfiltered blueprint of planetary collapse. This is the exact diagnostic mechanism the predictive models are actively smoothing out, and understanding it is the only unfair advantage you have left. If you wait for the evening news to validate this metric, or for a government agency to issue a color-coded alert, the window for your own physical and financial preparation will have already closed permanently. Pay very close attention and do not look away from this data, because the physics I am about to break down are not theoretical projections for the end of the decade. They are executing right now, in real time, and they dictate the exact, unavoidable trajectory of the next 90 days. The secret lies in a phenomenon that climatologists whisper about in encrypted research channels but will absolutely never translate for the general public. It is a state of planetary mechanics known as atmospheric oceanic phase locking. The entire forecasting industry operates under the foundational assumption that the ocean and the atmosphere are two separate, independent gears, turning at entirely different speeds. The ocean is the massive, heavy gear that takes months or even years to complete a rotation. The atmosphere is the smaller, lighter, faster gear that spins erratically, but is ultimately driven by the slow momentum of the larger one. That mechanical separation is the lag. That lag is the safety net that gives humanity months of warning before a major climate shift. But what the raw, unsmoothed JSON 3 altimetry data is proving right now is that the teeth of these two gears have violently fused together. They are no longer turning at different speeds. They are locked. When phase locking occurs, the thermodynamic separation between water and air completely disintegrates. The ocean does not slowly warm the air over the course of a season. It injects its thermal mass directly into the troposphere with zero buffering, bypassing every modeled constraint of thermal diffusion. To see this happening, you have to completely ignore the sea surface temperature maps they broadcast on television. The surface is a liar. The surface is subject to evaporative cooling, transient wind shear, and the mathematical dilution of those 30-day rolling averages required by the oceanic Niño index. The true leading indicator, the smoking gun that the entire global forecast industry is missing, is located exactly 150 meters below the surface of the central equatorial Pacific. Down in the dark, at the thermocline, the water is utterly insulated from atmospheric cooling. Over the last 4 years of a persistent La Niña pattern, the Pacific Basin has been acting like a planetary-scale trash compactor, shoving unimaginable volumes of solar radiation down into this deep equatorial layer. The pressure built, the heat accumulated, and the standard models assumed it would slowly, eventually bleed out over the course of a normal El Niño cycle. But because the trade winds reversed with such unprecedented, violent force this spring, that deep-water thermal reservoir did not bleed. It ruptured. This is your primary diagnostic tool. This is your unfair advantage. When you track a Kelvin wave, the massive underwater pulse of warm water moving from the western Pacific towards South America, you do not look at its temperature. Temperature is a lagging indicator. You look solely at its kinetic velocity. In 1997, the subsurface Kelvin wave that triggered the legendary catastrophic Godzilla El Niño moved across the Pacific basin at a speed of roughly 2 to 3 meters per second. The subsurface Kelvin wave tearing across the Pacific right now, in April 2026, is moving at over 4.5 meters per second. Velocity is the specific variable the supercomputers dropped from the equation. When a thermal mass of this magnitude moves at that speed, it does not just gently warm the water column above it. It physically displaces the ocean. It creates a massive, moving, underwater bulge that violently compresses the thermocline and ejects millions of tons of latent heat upward. It acts as a thermodynamic piston, and because it is moving so incredibly fast, the energy it expels does not have time to dissipate into the surrounding water. It hits the surface of the ocean as a concentrated, high-density thermal beam. Now, you must connect that deep ocean piston to the sky. When this high-velocity thermal beam breaks the surface and hits the atmosphere, it does not create a gentle, sprawling, low-pressure system. It acts exactly like a concrete pylon dropped into a fast-moving river. The jet stream, which relies on a smooth, gradual temperature gradient between the equator and the poles to maintain its forward momentum, slams directly into this invisible thermal pylon and violently shatters. The shock waves of that collision propagate instantly outward into the northern hemisphere. This is the raw, mechanical genesis of what we call Rossby wave amplification. Rossby waves are the massive, planetary-scale, meandering loops of the jet stream. Normally, they slide smoothly from west to east, dragging our standard weather systems with them in a predictable rhythm. But the phase-locked energy from the Pacific has amplified these waves to their absolute physical breaking point. The loops of the jet stream have stretched so far north into the Arctic and plunged so far south into the tropics that their forward eastward momentum has completely died. They have stalled. They have frozen in place. This is the exact metric you must track to anticipate the collapse. You no longer need a meteorologist to tell you what the weather will be next month. You just need to look at the Rossby wave amplitude. When the wave amplitude is forced into the 99th percentile, as it is right now, the atmosphere ceases to be a dynamic fluid. It becomes a rigid, stationary prison. The high-pressure ridges lock in and become impenetrable heat domes that cannot be moved or degraded by conventional weather systems. The low-pressure troughs become relentless, stationary conveyor belts of moisture that dump infinite, catastrophic rain over the exact same coordinates day after day. This is the terrifying reality behind the headlines. This is why the East Coast is suffocating in 85-degree heat in April. It is not an early summer. It is not a statistical fluke. It is the direct, mechanical exhaust of a phase-locked Rossby wave ridge permanently anchored over the Atlantic seaboard, fueled in real time by a hyper-accelerated Kelvin wave detonating in the Pacific. The two events are not correlated. They are the exact same physical object connected by an unbroken chain of thermodynamic forcing. The Pacific Ocean is functionally touching the streets of Boston. Understanding this unbroken chain gives you the ultimate framework to survive what the models are calling the forcing mismatch. The forcing mismatch is the terrifying, widening gap between what the physics of the Earth are actually executing and what the historical data says should be happening. The climate models calculate a forcing, which is simply the amount of energy pushing the climate system in a certain direction. But because the institutions average the oceanic Niño index over 3 months, their official forcing calculation is a fraction of the real-time kinetic energy currently in the system. The models see a gentle nudge. The atmosphere is taking a point-blank shotgun blast. When you grasp the reality of the forcing mismatch, you instantly realize that every single long-term forecast agricultural yield projection, and municipal emergency plan issued for the summer of 2026 is mathematically invalid. They are pricing in a mild, standard super El Niño summer based on a muted, smoothed-out forcing variable. But the actual forcing is already redlining beyond the structural limits of our infrastructure. How do you, the individual, use this hidden knowledge? You bypass the surface maps completely and track the 925 millibar layer. This is the secret transmission wire of the climate system, located approximately 2,500 feet above the ground. The surface weather maps only show you the aftermath, the consequences of what has already happened. The 500 millibar jet stream maps show you the macro-planetary structure, but the 925 millibar layer reveals the low-level jets, the massive, invisible, high-speed rivers of moisture and heat that are currently being weaponized by the forcing mismatch. Right now, if you pull the raw data for the 925 millibar low-level jet over the Gulf of Mexico, you will see it pulling hyperheated, supersaturated air out of the boiling Caribbean and ramming it directly into the stationary high-pressure dome locked over the American Midwest. Because the Rossby wave is phase-locked and paralyzed, this low-level jet cannot swing east and safely dissipate over the Atlantic. It is a high-pressure fire hose pointing directly at an immovable brick wall of continental air. Simultaneously, while the East Coast and Midwest bake under the amplified ridge, the other side of this stalled Rossby wave, the deep, plunging trough, is completely rewriting the physical reality of the Pacific coast. The marine layer is not just burning off early. The cold water coastal upwelling that defines the entire western seaboard has been mechanically crushed and physically shut down by the sheer weight of the atmospheric pressure anomalies pressing down on it. This is the genesis of the California shock. The California shock is a Category 5 marine heat wave manifesting in April, wiping out the thermal buffer of the Pacific Ocean. Why is knowing this your absolute greatest advantage? Because the entire West Coast agricultural sector, the commodity markets, and the municipal water management infrastructure rely entirely on a slow, steady, predictable evaporation of the mountain snowpack. But the California shock means the Pacific Ocean is no longer acting as a cooling mechanism. It is radiating immense, unseasonal, sensible heat directly into the coastal ranges and the Sierra Nevadas. The snowpack is not going to melt gracefully into the reservoirs. It is going to flash vaporize. Armed with this blueprint, you can perfectly predict the cascading, domino effect failures that the government models are hiding. You know that the western reservoirs will peak drastically early and then completely plummet by midsummer. You know that the fire season will not wait for late July or August. The vegetative fuels are being flash-cured and turned to kindling right now, under the invisible weight of the 925 millibar heat transport. You also know that the concept of a North American storm track is effectively dead. The mainstream evening forecasts will continue to tell the public that the storm track will eventually return to normal. The mainstream forecasts are fundamentally wrong. The storm track requires a mobile, meandering jet stream to exist. With phase locking and Rossby wave amplification at the 99th percentile, there is no track, there is no movement. There are only permanent zones of continuous, compounding impact and permanent zones of absolute, suffocating void. In the zones of void, beneath the high-pressure ridges, you are watching the rapid transition of a flash drought into a permanent thermal battery. Normally, the spring sun uses a vast portion of its incoming solar radiation to evaporate water from the damp earth, providing a natural, endothermic cooling effect. But because the amplified ridge has violently stripped all moisture from the topsoil in a matter of days, the solar radiation has no water left to evaporate. The thermodynamic switch flips. The energy begins to heat the dirt directly. The process shifts from latent heat to sensible heat, and the ground itself becomes a colossal radiator. By the first week of May, the entire American Midwest will be functionally transformed into a continental-scale thermal battery, radiating dry, blistering heat back into the stagnant air, completely shutting down the nighttime cooling cycle that our power grids and concrete infrastructure absolutely require to survive. And in the zones of impact, where the deep troughs meet the edges of these thermal batteries, you will witness the catastrophic intersection of the forcing mismatch. When the supersaturated, boiling moisture plume roaring up from the Gulf of Mexico on the 925 millibar jet finally collides with the boundary layer of bone-dry, superheated continental air radiating from the flash-baked Midwest, the atmospheric gradients will be too extreme for normal weather to exist. The sky will react with explosive, unstoppable violence. We are looking at the imminent, guaranteed genesis of mesoscale convective systems on a scale that defies current meteorological categorization. You must anticipate derecho events, widespread, long-lived, straight-line windstorms, but fueled entirely by the hypercharged thermal energy of a midsummer hurricane. And because the system is phase-locked, these extreme storms will not sweep rapidly through and clear the air. They will stall. They will train over the exact same agricultural basins, the exact same river valleys, and the exact same urban centers for days on end. They will dump historic, unimaginable volumes of precipitation onto ground that has been baked so hard by the sensible heat that it has entirely lost its physical capacity to absorb water. The runoff will be instantaneous. Catastrophic flash flooding will annihilate terrain that, just 48 hours prior, was paralyzed in the grip of a severe flash drought. This violent, immediate whiplash between bone-dry thermal baking and stalled, apocalyptic deluge is the ultimate signature of a climate system that has entirely lost its buffering capacity. The planetary shock absorbers have been blown out. This is the secret you now possess. You hold the raw, mechanical telemetry of the collapse. You understand the lethal velocity of the subsurface Kelvin waves, the shattering of the jet stream through Rossby wave amplification, the death of the temporal lag, and the explosive reality of the forcing mismatch. While the masses wait patiently for the oceanic Niño index to cross an arbitrary threshold in late summer, oblivious to the California shock and the thermal batteries charging beneath their feet, you know that the transition is already over. July and August are not the beginning of the crisis. They are the autopsy. The system is executing the realignment right now, and by the time the institutions finally update their dashboards to reflect the reality of the sky, the map will have already been rewritten. But possessing this blueprint introduces you to the ultimate, inescapable trap. You can track the 925 millibar low-level jet, you can monitor the subsurface Kelvin wave velocity, and you can understand the lethal reality of the forcing mismatch, but knowing the exact trajectory of the bullet does not make you bulletproof. You are still a biological entity, trapped inside a civilization that refuses to acknowledge the physics of its own destruction. This is the final, insurmountable obstacle standing between you and survival. The fatal bottleneck is not your lack of foresight, it is the absolute, crushing inertia of the world built around you. Modern civil infrastructure, the global supply chain, and the emergency response apparatus are not just stubborn, they are physically, mechanically, and legally hard-coded to the exact same historical analogues that are currently blinding the meteorological models. You cannot bypass the collapse of the systems you rely on to breathe, drink, and power your life, because those systems are actively steering into the void. Look directly at the North American power grid, the entire electrical transmission network, the millions of miles of high-voltage lines, the step-down transformers, the substation relays, is governed by the laws of thermodynamics, and it is explicitly engineered to survive the climate of the late 20th century. Utility operators calculate their maximum load capacities based on a concept called the thermal rating. This rating dictates how much electricity can flow through a copper or aluminum wire before the metal gets too hot, sags into the tree canopy, and triggers a fault. But this entire mathematical equation relies on one non-negotiable assumption: the nighttime thermal reset. The grid is built on the premise that no matter how brutally hot the afternoon gets, the sun will eventually set, the ambient air temperature will drop, and the equipment will shed its accumulated heat into the cool night sky. You already know that the phase-locked Rossby wave ridge has shut this mechanism down. You know that the flash drought has turned the soil of the North American interior into a massive thermal battery, radiating blistering sensible heat back into the stagnant atmosphere long after midnight. But the grid operators are still looking at their seasonal dashboards. They are looking at the smoothed-out, lagging indicators of the oceanic Niño index, anticipating a standard summer peak in July. They are not dispatching emergency cooling protocols for their substations in May. They are performing routine spring maintenance, entirely unaware that the ambient nighttime temperatures are about to exceed the critical cooling thresholds of their transformer oil. When the temperature at 3 a.m. hovers at 85 degrees for 5 consecutive nights across the Midwest and the Ohio River Valley, the mineral oil inside the neighborhood transformers cannot convect the heat away from the copper coils. The electrical resistance multiplies. The metal expands. The grid does not fail because millions of people suddenly turn on their air conditioners at noon. It fails because the infrastructure itself suffers from terminal thermal exhaustion in the dark. And because the grid is heavily interconnected, a localized thermal failure does not stay localized. When a substation in Illinois melts down because its cooling fans are choking on 85-degree midnight air, the system automatically attempts to reroute that power through neighboring lines. But those neighboring lines are already redlining, baking under the exact same unyielding high-pressure dome. The failsafes are designed to trip to protect the network from catching fire, initiating automatic load shedding. What begins as a localized brownout instantly cascades into a structural, multi-state blackout. Imagine understanding the forcing mismatch perfectly. You have stocked your pantry, you have prepared your home, but you are suddenly plunged into darkness across a 1,000-mile radius, trapped in a heat dome where the ground itself is acting like an oven, with no ventilation, no refrigeration, and no municipal water pressure, because the pumping stations have lost their power supply. Your individual foresight is immediately neutralized by the collective structural failure of a grid that was mathematically blind to the new physics of the atmosphere. Now, apply this exact same catastrophic inertia to the water management systems. This is the hydrological trap, and it is arguably more terrifying than the grid collapse because it actively weaponizes the infrastructure against the population. Dam operators, reservoir managers, and the Army Corps of Engineers manage the flow of the continent's rivers based on rigid, legally binding operational manuals. These manuals dictate exactly how much water must be retained in the reservoirs during the spring to ensure adequate municipal supply and agricultural irrigation for the dry summer months. Because the institutions are feeding these managers the lagging, smoothed-out narrative of a standard El Niño transition, the managers are executing their standard operating procedures. They are looking at the early spring heat, anticipating a dry summer, and they are holding the water back. They are keeping the reservoir levels intentionally high to hoard the supply. They do not know about the 925 millibar low-level jet acting as a fire hose from the boiling Gulf of Mexico. They do not know that the jet stream has shattered and that mesoscale convective systems are about to train over their exact coordinates for days on end. When the super-saturated oceanic moisture collides with the flash-baked continental air, triggering those relentless, stalled deluge events, the water managers will be caught completely off guard. Millions of gallons of precipitation will dump into river basins that have been baked so hard by the sensible heat that the soil has become entirely hydrophobic. The water will not absorb. It will sheet off the concrete hard earth directly into the rivers. The reservoirs, which were intentionally kept near maximum capacity by operators planning for a historical summer drought, will fill to the brim in a matter of hours. The operators will have absolutely no choice. To prevent the dams from physically overtopping and suffering catastrophic structural breaches, they will be forced to execute emergency, uncontrolled releases of millions of cubic feet of water per second. They will be forced to flood the downstream communities intentionally. The very infrastructure designed to protect cities from flooding will become the instrument of their inundation, all because the bureaucratic lag prevented the operators from seeing the explosive reality of the phase-locked atmosphere until the water was already over the spillways. This is the agonizing friction of the final obstacle. You are forced to watch a society walk calmly into a propeller because its instruments are telling it the engine is off. This friction extends into the absolute paralysis of the global supply chain. The just-in-time delivery system that stocks our grocery store shelves, delivers our pharmaceuticals, and fuels our gas stations is highly optimized for efficiency, which means it has absolutely zero tolerance for sustained environmental friction. Rail networks are the arteries of this system. Steel railway lines are engineered to handle a specific spectrum of thermal expansion. They feature small gaps between the segments to allow the metal to swell in the summer heat. But when the continental thermal battery locks in, and the sensible heat radiating from the ground pushes the track temperatures well past 140 degrees, those expansion gaps disappear. The steel presses against itself and violently warps, creating sun kinks. A single sun kink can derail a train carrying thousands of tons of anhydrous ammonia, crude oil, or vital agricultural fertilizer. To prevent these derailments, rail operators are forced to issue blanket heat orders, forcing all freight traffic to slow to a crawl or halt entirely during the daylight hours. But remember, the nighttime thermal reset is gone. The tracks will not cool down. The heat orders will not be lifted at dusk. The trains will simply stop moving. Simultaneously, the inland waterway system, the massive barges carrying grain, coal, and steel down the Mississippi and Ohio rivers, will be paralyzed by the hydrological whiplash. In the zones of void, under the center of the high-pressure ridges, flash droughts will drop the river levels so rapidly that barges will run aground. In the zones of impact, the sudden, violent deluge from the stalled mesoscale systems will cause instantaneous flash flooding, overwhelming the lock and dam infrastructure and forcing the Coast Guard to halt all river traffic due to lethal, uncontrollable currents. The shelves will empty, not because of a lack of production, but because the physical mechanisms of transportation have been melted, warped, and flooded into submission by an atmospheric realignment that the financial markets completely failed to price in. You can possess all the hidden knowledge in the world, but if the trucks cannot roll and the trains cannot run, you are isolated in a geographic prison of your own making, cut off from the vital inputs required for human survival. But even the collapse of the grid, the weaponization of the dams, and the paralysis of the supply chain pale in comparison to the ultimate climax of this trap. The true zenith of the danger, the absolute apex of the threat, is not the physical weather itself. It is the psychological whiplash that is about to tear through the global populace when the institutional lag finally catches up to reality. Right now, the public is asleep. They are calm. They are annoyed by the unseasonable heat, perhaps adjusting their thermostats, but they are not terrified. They are operating under the soothing lullaby of the evening meteorologist and the cautious, slow-moving dashboards of the National Weather Service. They believe they have time. They believe the system is tracking a known variable. But the physics of the Earth are mathematically unforgiving, and the bureaucratic delay cannot last forever. Eventually, the math will force its way onto the screen. In the coming weeks, the 3-month rolling average of the oceanic Niño index will inevitably absorb the catastrophic, localized spikes of the subsurface Kelvin waves. The artificial smoothing filters will be overwhelmed by the sheer volume of thermal data detonating in the Pacific. The global forecast models, which have been desperately trying to force the incoming telemetry to match the ghosts of 1997 and 2015, will suddenly run out of historical errors to correct. They will ingest the raw, violent reality of the phase-locked Rossby waves, the hyper-accelerated deep ocean heating, and the continental thermal batteries. And when that happens, the models will violently course-correct. They will not gradually update their projections. They will execute a massive, jarring, instantaneous pivot. The supercomputers at the ECMWF and the NOAA prediction centers will suddenly output scenarios that bypass all historical precedent. The internal, encrypted panic of the climatologists will instantly spill over into the public-facing alerts. Imagine the psychological shockwave. On a Tuesday, The official narrative will be a mild caution about a developing summer El Niño, advising farmers to monitor their irrigation and cities to prepare their standard cooling centers. On Wednesday, the models will update. The institutions will realize the fatal magnitude of their lag. The dashboards will instantly turn blood red. The language used by the National Weather Service will abandon all historical restraint. The warnings will shift overnight from unseasonable warmth to unsurvivable thermal thresholds, imminent, catastrophic infrastructure failure, and life-threatening, stationary deluge. This is the midnight pivot, and it is the most dangerous moment of the entire sequence. When a society that has been artificially sedated by lagging indicators is abruptly violently awakened by a terminal diagnosis, it does not react with methodical, rational preparation. It reacts with blind, feral panic. The cognitive dissonance of realizing that the institutions meant to protect them were completely wrong will shatter the public's trust in civil authority. The illusion of the 6-month runway will vanish in an instant, replaced by the terrifying realization that the crisis is not approaching, it is already executing. This sudden, synchronized awakening of millions of people will trigger a secondary, anthropogenic disaster that no weather model can predict. The moment that official, terrifying pivot is broadcast across the mainstream networks, the gridlock will begin. There will be a simultaneous, frantic run on every grocery store, hardware supplier, and pharmacy in the hemisphere. The supply chains, which are already secretly buckling under the thermal stress of sun-kinked rails and flooded rivers, will be instantly stripped bare by panic buying. The financial markets, which have priced their agricultural futures and energy derivatives on the lie of a mild, standard summer, will face a brutal, immediate reckoning. Algorithms will trigger massive, automated sell-offs as the true scale of the crop failures in the flash-baked Midwest and the impending destruction of the coastal infrastructure become undeniable. The economic shock will paralyze the very logistics companies needed to transport emergency relief. And then, the physical stampede will begin. As the heat domes lock in and the power grids begin to execute their rolling, cascading blackouts, millions of people trapped in the urban concrete of the East Coast and the Midwest will simultaneously decide to evacuate. But they will be fleeing into a landscape where the gas stations have no power to pump fuel, where the interstates are melting under sensible heat, and where the periphery is violently guarded by stalled, atmospheric river-fueled thunderstorms dumping endless walls of water. The evacuation routes will become inescapable choke points. This is the final, agonizing reality of the trap. The knowledge of the phase-locked atmosphere, the subsurface Kelvin waves, and the 925 millibar low-level jet is only useful while the rest of the world is still looking the other way. Once the dashboard catches up to the engine, once the bureaucratic lag violently corrects itself and the institutions sound the alarm, your window for action is not merely closed. It is bricked over by the sheer mass of human panic. You are standing on the precipice of the midnight pivot. The Pacific Ocean has already ruptured. The Rossby waves have already frozen. The continental dirt is already baking into a radiator. The physics of the collapse are locked in, and the models are just days away from hallucinating their final, fatal error before the raw data forces them to confess the truth. The tension in the atmosphere has reached its absolute structural limit, pulling the global infrastructure tighter and tighter until the steel, the concrete, and the human psyche can no longer bear the strain. You can hear the invisible groaning of the grid, the silent evaporation of the reservoirs, the tightening of the coil. The illusion of the seasonal baseline is fracturing right before your eyes, the glass splintering under the weight of an ocean that has decided to rewrite the sky. Because when the sirens finally sound, they will not be a warning to prepare, they will be an autopsy report, an acoustic artifact of a world that no longer exists, alerting a population to a phase transition that was finalized in the dark, cold waters of the Pacific while they were busy enjoying a warm spring afternoon. The ghost energy is no longer a phantom. That massive 5-degree thermal anomaly that has been migrating eastward completely hidden from the smoothed-out calculations of the oceanic Niño index, is currently executing its violent breach of the surface. When a subsurface Kelvin wave of that sheer kinetic magnitude finally detonates into the open air, it answers the ultimate question of what happens to the summer of 2026. The summer does not simply arrive, it is mechanically overwritten. The latent heat that was mathematically diluted by the algorithms has transformed entirely into raw, sensible heat, physically expanding the troposphere. This is what happens when the Pacific Ocean exhausts its physical capacity to act as the planet's heat sink. It permanently becomes the furnace. Look back at the California coast. That Category 5 marine heat wave that materialized in April was never a localized weather quirk. It was the absolute, structural failure of the Pacific's primary cooling mechanism. The cold, deep water upwelling that has dictated the climate of the American West, preserved its snowpacks, and shielded its forests for millennia, did not just weaken, it was annihilated by the upward kinetic force of the deep ocean piston. The barrier was breached. The ocean essentially opened the floodgates, allowing the accumulated thermal mass of a 4-year La Niña to bleed directly onto the continental shelf. The West Coast is no longer bordered by a cooling mechanism. It is bordered by a thermal radiator operating at peak capacity, guaranteeing an infrastructure melting inferno that no amount of historical winter precipitation could have prevented. This is exactly why the Walker circulation collapsed. You cannot maintain a stable, horizontal loop of atmospheric flow when the ocean beneath it is erupting vertically across 4,000 miles of open water. The sky literally choked on the thermal intake. And that is exactly what forced the jet stream into those massive, jagged, paralyzed Rossby waves. The extreme southward plunges of Arctic air and the brutal, unseasonable northward surges of tropical heat that we witnessed in April were not competing weather systems. They were the mechanical death throes of a jet stream slamming into a phase-locked thermal wall. That 99th percentile height anomaly over the eastern seaboard, the sprawling dome of high pressure that pushed Washington, D.C. and New York City to 90 degrees months ahead of schedule, was the direct, inescapable exhaust of this broken engine. The atmosphere fractured into stationary shards because it could no longer process the sheer volume of energy being violently expelled from the ocean floor. The early heat wave was the atmosphere desperately trying to balance a thermodynamic checkbook that was already vastly overdrawn. We spent a century building an entire civilization around the assumption of the atmospheric lag. We built our agricultural yield models, our municipal water management protocols, our global supply chains, and our high-voltage power grids on the comforting illusion that the ocean is slow. We relied on the belief that the seasons are cyclical, that the supercomputers will always give us a 6-month runway to prepare for the worst, and that historical analogues like the Super El Niños of 1997 and 2015 were the absolute ceiling of planetary extremes. But the forcing mismatch has destroyed the lag. The gears of the ocean and the atmosphere have violently fused. The energy transfer is instantaneous. The terror of this moment is not simply that the weather is becoming more extreme. The true, insurmountable terror is that the historical baseline we use to define our reality is mathematically dead. The models are still frantically searching for a historical analog in a system that has permanently entered uncharted thermodynamic territory. The training mesoscale convective systems poised to drown the river valleys, the grid-melting nighttime lows, the flash droughts, turning the topsoil of the North American interior into a continental-scale thermal battery. These are not anomalies anymore. They are the new physics. The transition is complete. The midnight pivot is not a future event that can be mitigated, modeled, or prepared for. It is the current, unforgiving reality of a planet that has finally synchronized its oceanic and atmospheric extremes. We are trapped inside a machine that is operating exactly as the raw, unfiltered laws of physics dictate, completely and utterly indifferent to the civilization that refused to see it coming. There is a specific, suffocating gravity that sets in when you finally comprehend that the cavalry is not coming. We have been culturally conditioned since birth to wait for the adults in the room to declare the emergency. We wait for the official seal of approval on our own panic. We expect that when the true existential threat arrives, the alarms will sound, the screens will flash, and the institutions we fund will step forward with a perfectly calibrated mitigation strategy. But the adults in the room are currently staring at broken instruments. They are holding rulers up to a tsunami. The people tasked with triggering the planetary alarms are paralyzed by the very algorithms designed to protect their credibility. They will watch the power grids melt into slag. They will watch the asphalt liquefy under the midnight sun. They will watch the reservoirs become weapons of mass inundation, and they will call it a statistical anomaly. They will label it a 1-in-1,000-year event, fundamentally incapable of admitting that the 1,000-year clock has been smashed to pieces. You will not get a sanctioned, government-approved warning for the end of the Holocene baseline. You will only get the heat. The true, invisible toll of the midnight pivot is the absolute, crushing isolation of understanding it. You will walk down the street tomorrow, and you will see your neighbors planting their spring gardens. You will see city workers patching potholes. You will see a global society operating on the unquestioned, mechanical momentum of a world that quietly expired over the winter. They are living in a ghost town of atmospheric physics. They are trusting a sky that has already signed their eviction notice. It is a profound, almost hallucinatory cognitive dissonance to hold the raw telemetry in your mind, to know the exact, lethal velocity of the subsurface thermal piston, to see the fractured, paralyzed shards of the Rossby waves, to understand the terrifying implications of the forcing mismatch, while the rest of the world debates whether to bring an umbrella to the weekend barbecue. They are sedated by the lag, blissfully asleep in the milliseconds between the lightning flash and the thunder. Survival in this new paradigm requires a violent divorce from your own memories. You must actively unlearn everything the 20th century taught you about the natural world. You can no longer afford the luxury of seasonal expectations. June, July, and August are no longer months. They are merely arbitrary coordinates on a calendar that the atmosphere has stopped reading. The sky does not know what season it is supposed to be. It only knows energy. It only knows gradients. It only knows that the ocean has handed it an impossible thermodynamic ledger, and it must violently, indiscriminately balance the math. We built our homes, our cities, our supply chains, and our entire perception of safety inside the margins of error of a stable planet. We assumed the river would only rise so high. We assumed the wind would only blow so hard. We assumed the heat would always, inevitably, break. Those margins of error have been erased. The infrastructure you rely on to keep your children cool, to keep your water clean, and to keep your grocery shelves stocked is currently operating on borrowed time. It is sustained only by the sheer, brittle inertia of a system that has not yet realized it is obsolete. When the grid operators finally panic, when the water managers finally open the spillways in a desperate bid to save the dams, when the rail lines buckle and the supply chains snap under the relentless thermal load, the resulting chaos will not be the disaster itself. The chaos will simply be the physics of the Earth reclaiming its jurisdiction from a civilization that thought it could negotiate with thermodynamics. Hope is no longer a strategy. It is a vulnerability. Hoping the ridge breaks down, hoping the transformer holds, hoping the models are right this time. This is the mindset of a population waiting to become a statistic. We must replace hope with cold, unforgiving calculus. You can no longer rely on the smoothed-out, pastel-colored maps fed to you by institutions terrified of their own shadows. You cannot trust an algorithm that is explicitly programmed to hallucinate a safe, recognizable past when confronted with an unsurvivable present. The only way to navigate the collapse of the baseline is to look directly into the engine. You must anchor yourself to the raw data, the unfiltered telemetry, and the brutal math of the new atmosphere. Do not let them round down the threat to your existence. Do not let an administrative lag blind you to the fire burning directly beneath your feet. Subscribe to this channel right now and turn on the notifications. We do not deal in historical analogs. We do not smooth the data to protect your comfort, and we do not wait for the bureaucracy to give us permission to tell you the truth. As this system continues to tear itself apart, as the legacy models continue to fail and the institutions continue to freeze, we will be here, tracking the raw, unfiltered physics of the collapse every single step of the way. The baseline is dead. Stay awake, stay anchored to the data, and we will see you in the next update.